Okay, so in this tutorial, we're going to look at some of the other layer types, right? In the first tutorial, which went a little bit slowly because my computer was being fussy, we covered basically how to import assets, specifically still images, as layers and bring them in, right? Anything that you can imagine importing, you can bring in as an asset and use as a layer. So any type of image can be used as a layer. Video footage can be used as a layer. Adobe Illustrator files can be used as layers, and you can actually, similar to how you can use, you can essentially access the individual layers in a Photoshop document. You can also, if you've sorted your vector objects in an Illustrator file into layers, you can also access those Illustrator layers as individual components in your project as well. So those are the things you can bring in, and you can bring in audio, and there's a couple other things too. But there's a lot of layers that exist in After Effects that you can use as well, and we're going to look at what some of those are and what they're and why we have them. So let's go ahead and just create a new composition. And again, we're going to leave it here. We'll just call this layers for days and hit OK. Okay, so we've got our base composition set up. So let's start looking at some of the different types of layers we can create. First, if we go up to the layer menu at the top of the screen and go down to new, there are several options here, right? There's text, solid, light, camera, null object, shape layer, adjustment layer, content aware fill, blah, 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 Adobe Photoshop file, etc. So what we're going to look at first, we're not going to really look at the light or the camera yet. We'll talk about the null object we might talk about it a bit today. And then we definitely are going to talk about the shape layer, the adjustment layer, texts, and solids. So let's start with a solid. So a solid is literally what it sounds like. It is a solid colored layer, right? So right now it's dark gray solid 1, but if I go ahead and click on this little gray blob there, I can choose any color that I want to. I'm going to go with something reasonably pleasant to look at. And I can choose that color. You'll see it then updates the name for me. I could also rename this to whatever I want. I could keep it the size of the composition. I could also make it bigger, smaller, whatever needs to happen. But I'm going to leave it the same, right? It's essentially going to be like my background. So I've got this solid layer. And then with this solid layer, there's things I can do with a solid. I can create masks on the solid, right? So if I have this layer selected and I come up here to my toolbar at the top of the screen, I could either use the pen tool or say the rectangle, rounded rectangle, star, polygon, one of these options. I'm going to go ahead and just try rounded rectangle. And if I click and drag on this, what I'm doing is I'm essentially creating a mask on the image, on that solid layer. And so it allows me to very quickly and easily create like a solid filled in box, right? I don't have a whole lot of settings on this. I can basically move this layer around. You'll notice that this is currently the whole layer, right? I could, if I wanted to, I can click on these individual points and, manipulate my mask to any shape I want. But it allows me to just make solid colors, right? It's pretty great, pretty simple. There are other reasons to use a solid, and we'll look at those in a second. So I've got my solid here, right? And I can just create outlines, essentially, or masks, and put this on top of other layers. It's just a very simple thing. There's oftentimes when you just need a solid color, and this does it for you. Okay, so solids are one option. One of the other layers that we can look at is obviously text. So let's go ahead and take a look at text. So a text layer, surprisingly enough, holds text. And so if I just go ahead and type, I don't know, text layers are awesome. Okay, so I've written text layers are awesome, right? And so I've got this layer called text layers are awesome. And if I click on the name, then I can select the entire thing. And if I click open the little drop down, there's a couple options down here, right? There's my transform and there's my text. And the text has a couple options too. There's the path options, and it says path none, and that's because the path is like if I had drawn a line that the text was applied to, which I haven't. And then there's some more options in here. There's things about fill and stroke and blah, 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 right? So there's some options there, but what I really want to focus on is over here in my character tab, right? This is where I can adjust all of the settings for whatever text layer I have selected. So rather than finding all of that in here or all of that in my effect controls for my text layer, right, where all those settings are is as long as I have this selected, I can come over here and I can make my adjustments, right? So if I want this text to be, significantly larger, and I can click the letter V or click on the arrow to manipulate the position of this. All right, I can also use the paragraph tab to adjust whether the text is centered, left or right aligned. If I have more text on the screen, there's other things I can do there I'm not super interested in right now. Right, and so I can adjust any of the standard text settings to change the color of the text. Right, I can go ahead and use this color setting, and there's these two options, right? This is the fill color, and then if there's a stroke, which there isn't right now, and this would look awful with a stroke on it, you can go ahead and do that. Now, Ingleboard just has striped as its option. Yeah, okay. One of the other things, right, that we can do, and text is something where we frequently want it to be aligned. And so if I want this aligned in the center, right, I can click center. If I want it centered vertically, I can align that in the center vertically, right? So text layers are just that. They hold text. You can hit, enter to create, multiple lines. You can also, if I was to deselect this all and use this horizontal type tool, if I click and drag, I can also create a text box. So then if I'm writing something, right, this is where some of those paragraph styles come in, and whether it's going to hyphenate things or whether it's going to, or whether I'm going to have, my text justified. Right, it allows me to do that as well. And then again, if I need that to be bigger or smaller, right, I can make those adjustments like you would normally. And in order to rotate it, however, I do need to use my rotate tool. All right, and then the anchor points there, it's the same as using an anchor point on a normal layer, right? Currently here, it's rotating around that S for some reason, but if I use my pan behind tool, right, I can pull this down to a corner or, to this edge over here, and then use my rotate tool again, right, and rotate it wherever it needs to go, right? And all of these things, text layers also, they all have, they have scale, position, and rotation keyframes as well, right? Anything you can keyframe for a normal layer, you can keyframe for a text layer. Okay, so we're just going to keep piling these layers up, right? We've got 2 text layers and this cyan solid layer. So let's go ahead and go to our, we're not going to do a null object yet, but we're going to go ahead and do a shape layer. Now, a shape layer opens up several options. This is like a little miniature version of Illustrator within After Effects, right? So you'll see I have the ability to have a fill, a stroke, set the stroke width. There's some other things I can add on there. I can either use this to create a mask or to create a shape, right? And currently, because we're doing a shape layer, we want to create a shape. And so one of the things that can be confusing in After Effects is the same tools that create a mask also create shapes, right? The pen tool, the all these shape tools here, they can either create a filled shape with a stroke on it, or they can create a mask. And so you just have to be careful and make sure you have the correct thing highlighted and that you have your shape layer selected. And so I'm going to go ahead and just create a star because everybody loves stars. So I'm just going to click and drag. And when I do that, now I've created a star. Now it's highlighted in purple, so I can't actually see the stroke right now. So I'm going to use the letter V. I'm just going to click over here and drag the star somewhere in here. And then I'm going to click off. Now you'll notice in my case it looks like these text layers are on top or showing through the star layer, and that's because I had the solid selected when I created the shape layer. And so whatever layer you have selected when you create a new layer, it puts the new layer immediately above that in the hierarchy. Right? So if I want this to be on top of everything, I can click and drag and bring it to the top. So let's go ahead and look at how we can adjust some of these things. So first, right, I want my stroke to be fatter. Right, so I'm going to make it a 27-point stroke, so it's significantly broader. And then if I want to change the color, right, I can come in here and I can make this, whatever color I want it to be. Let's just say yellow. And then there's other things where you're like, man, I wish I could do a gradient in here, or I wish I could do a dashed line for the stroke, or something like that. The way you do that in After Effects is you either hover over the blue text and click, and then you get, say, your fill options, right? So in this case, I'm doing a solid. I could also do no fill, so it's just a stroke. Or I could do a linear gradient, and there's ways to adjust those settings. Or I could do a radial gradient, right? And so some of the things I have to hit OK before I can do that. I can also adjust the fill, the way that the fill blends with layers below it, right? So if I say this is multiply when it's black like that, probably isn't going to happen. And it says it's previewing, but it's not previewing. This is most likely refined to a shape layer, but just give me a second here. Okay, so then, right, so here's my opacity, right? I can adjust the opacity of the fill. And I can hit OK. And then with the stroke, the same thing. I can basically adjust whether the stroke has a gradient on it or is a solid color. Again, I can adjust the opacity of that stroke, and I can adjust the blend mode of the stroke as well. Right? So linear burn, you'll notice it's impacting the star, but it's not impacting anything below it. Right? And so these blend modes are only going to be effective against other objects on the shape layer. So speaking of other objects on the shape layer, let's just go ahead and do overlay on this. Go hit OK. To adjust the gradient, right, there are some handles here, right? So I can adjust how bright this center is. I can actually move this off center if I want. And this little edge here, again, adjust where that highlight is, right, in the whether it's centered over the center of the circle or whether it's off to the side. Right, so those are some of the settings I have on this that I can manipulate. And so what I can do is, if I have the shape layer selected, I can also come up here and I can make more shapes. Right, so I'm not going to do a star this time. I'm going to do a polygon. And so if I click and drag on my polygon, you'll notice that it starts with 5 corners. If I keep my finger down on my mouse and I click the up or down arrow, I can add or remove sides. And the same goes for the star. I can either add or remove the number of points on the star. Right, so I'm going to go ahead and leave this here. Right, so now I've got these 2 objects that are part of the shape layer. And if you notice, my shape layer here is now taking up all of this space. I have this polystar 2, polystar 1, and so each one has its own thing. I can turn the visibility of each of these off, and I can move each of these independently as well. Right, so if I click on the Move tool or the Selection tool, I can bring this over and then overlay it on top of this. And now if I go to my Fill again and say instead of Screen, let's do Multiply, right, you'll see the impact that this has. If I hit OK, and if I click on my gradient now, where this fill is, this is how I change the color of my gradient, right? So I can say, okay, I want the center, or that stop to be red, and this stop to be, I don't know, let's say blue. All right, so now I've made this gradient go from red to blue, and it's multiplying the other shape that it's on top of, right? So with this, part of this is that everything can get really complex really quickly in a shape layer, right? Because I can have multiple shapes, and each one of these shapes I can adjust many, many different settings, and we're not going to get into all of them. But the big thing is that I want you to note is that under the, right, this is polystar 2, this is this one. What's funny is it says polystar path 1, right? So there's this path, and that's defining the shape. And then, so I can adjust the position, right, of this shape. Notice that the shape moves, but the gradient does not. I can also adjust the scale by adjusting the size of the outer radius and the outer roundness. I can actually go from hard corners to inverted corners to really rounded, and then it just keeps kind of, right, going a little bit, right? But so I can adjust how round this thing is pretty simply through using this. And all of these are, or what are they called? All of these are keyframeable, right? The stroke, there's lots of settings for that, and it just goes on and on and on. And it really depends on what you want to do and what you're attempting to do. And so there are several options here. One of the things that you can do is you can add dashes, right? So if I click this plus by the dashes, I can, right, make it so that this surface, this is no longer a solid line. I can adjust the offset so that I could animate them rotating around this path. There's this ability to taper that I believe is now new, right? So I can have it start at a narrow end here, and then I can make the, right, I can have the end length. I can have it actually not go all the way around. The start width, I can make it, fully fat, or I can make it start at 0 or close to 0. And then there's this easing as well, right? So is it a linear change, or is it more of a curve change from skinny to fat? Right, so there are just a ton of things, and you can animate all of these. You can keyframe all of these things. Typically, we only keyframe 1 or 2 or maybe 3 characteristics on an object at once. But I just want you to know you can animate everything, and it can be incredibly complex. Okay, so that's shape layers, right? You can also we might as well, while we're on the shape layer, draw one of our own. You can also use the pen tool to draw your own shape layer, right? So I'm just going to click and drag and click and drag and click and drag, right? And it's because my computer's being fussy, right? And then I just ended it. Right, and I can continue to adjust this. I can also select these individual points, right, and adjust where they are in the object. So there's a lot that you can do with shape layers. If you're trying to create some sort of graphics, this is one of the ways to do that. I'm going to go ahead and save this right now because I haven't saved it yet. I'm just going to call it tutorial 9. Okay. So now what we need to do is look at a couple other types of layers. So we've got our shape layer, we've got these other things. So let's go ahead and look at what an adjustment layer is. So we're going to go ahead and click on adjustment layer. Now, when we do that, nothing happens. An adjustment layer is essentially a blank layer where any of the effects that you apply to the adjustment layer get applied to everything in the composition below that adjustment layer. So let's go ahead and go to our effects and preset over here in this list of options. And let's do something really obvious. Let's go ahead and we'll just do blur and sharpen. That'll be easy, and we're going to do the fast box blur. So I'm just going to go ahead and double click on fast box blur. And when I do this, I'm going to crank up my blur radius to 11. And you'll notice that everything underneath is blurred, right? Now, if I turn the visibility of my adjustment layer off, and then I say select, let's select one of our text layers, right? And if I apply that same effect just to the text layer, right, the text is blurry, but nothing else is blurred, right? Even if I was to bring this text layer up to the top, above my adjustment layer, right, that has not been impacted, right? Adjustment layers are great for when you have a whole composition and you need to say, maybe you want to color correct the whole composition, or you want to have the entire thing blur, and rather than trying to keyframe blur on 12 layers or something like that, you can just use a single adjustment layer to blur the entire thing. And there's other ways to do that as well, but that's one. It's one of those tools that works pretty well. And if I pull this adjustment layer on top, you'll notice that it actually blurs this layer that's already blurry a little bit more than everything else that's blurred on there, right? And so any effect that you want to put on there, you can. So maybe we do some color correction, and we'll just say, oh, let's do channel mixer. And we are going to just sort of crank some settings around, right? Make this thing look really awful. Ooh. And so there are, right, there's, yeah, it just applies it to everything else underneath it. Okay. So I'm going to save this again because I'm making something really beautiful. And then I want to show you well, we're going to talk about null layers later, because that's a little bit, there's a longer tutorial where we're going to take, say, 3 pieces of an arm and link them together and animate them, and that's one of the ways we'll use null layers. But a null layer is basically just a way to group layers together. And so, and we'll talk about how that works exactly. But there's other reasons to use them. Sometimes you need to have something that you can adjust, but that isn't the object itself. I don't know how else to describe that. It makes things a little bit easier to manage, sort of like a group can. Okay, so that is our simple tutorial on different types of layers, and so I would like you to basically play with those layers and play with keyframing some of the settings on there, just to experiment with what that looks like. Okay, and I'm interested to see like what exactly you make out of what I just showed you. Yeah, all right, that's all I got.